Hello there. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Fletcher Futures. I'm Dorothy Orzelak with the Institute for Business here of Global Context, or IBGC, as it is affectionately known here in the halls of Fletcher. This is where the world of business meets the world, and this is where we live in those in-between spaces, crossing all kinds of borders, geographical, physical, disciplinary, industrial, just this is our Fletcher superpower. So welcome to everyone here. I know we're going to have people streaming in and joining us as it is 5:30 here Eastern Standard Time on a Wednesday afternoon. So switch on your videos. We'd love to have a friendly, casual conversation here. We'd love to see you all. So we're gathered here for another edition of Fletcher Futures. This is where we bring together a mentor, a faculty member, a professor with a Fletcher alumnus to reconnect, to kind of take a trip back in time to discuss some things that are currently happening in terms of what the alum is doing in the real world since graduating. And so it's built on their foundation of their Fletcher classes, their Fletcher extracurricular activities and experiences. And so we have an opportunity to listen in on this conversation and catch up on all the interesting things that the alumnus has been doing since graduating from Fletcher. And we call it Fletcher Futures specifically because it represents the various places and also the big hairy problems that you get to work on with your Fletcher degree and how it gets to carry you into that future. So sometimes we know what that's going to do, and sometimes it takes you into very unexpected ways. So one of the problems that we are currently going to be covering in today's session is how to deliver a just energy transition for Africa and climate resilience on the continent. We have some great conversations to come on that. So let me warmly introduce you to our Professor Laurent Jacques. He is the Walter Risden Professor of Finance and Banking, International Banking here at Fletcher, and he's one of our beloved faculty members. I mean, he has single-handedly converted so many students to the art that is finance. So welcome, Professor Jacques. And we also have Imad Ahmed, who is MIB 2011, and he's an energy and climate advisor at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change in the UK. I know it's a rather late hour, and I know you're not drinking espresso to stay awake, but thank you for being with us this evening. So this discussion is going to run about an hour, and we'd love to have all of you participate and join us as questions pop up. This is a dialogue that is all for you. So feel free to either post up your yellow virtual hand and post a question that way, and we'll call you in, or post a question in the chat and we'll do it virtually and get it in. So let me now turn this over to Professor Laurent Jacques.
Thank you, Dorothy, for the introduction and your kind words. I'd like to, Imad, I'd like to welcome you back to Fletcher. You've been back at Fletcher, I know, at the 5th reunion, but this is remote welcoming back. Actually, it's Imad Ahmed, Dr. Ahmed, as of not long ago. So, Imad, welcome back. So let's start a conversation about what you've been up to over the last few years since you've graduated from Fletcher, and then time allowing, we'd like to love to hear about your research and your new book, which is on a burning, literally, topic. So let's start with your years before Fletcher, post-Fletcher. What is striking is how many interesting experiences and position you've held over those years. It's actually, this is something that was, I think, very characteristic of you before you came to Fletcher, and Fletcher did not change that. You continued on the same track. before Fletcher, you have a political campaign with John Kerry. You have working on behalf of human rights of women in Pakistan. You come to Fletcher, and then you go to Africa to advise government of Rwanda. You Ethiopia, work on energy project and others. So maybe you can revisit all of this in some detail and tell us a little bit what is the thread that really ties together your multifaceted career so far.
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Jacques. And first of all, thank you very much for having me, Dorothy and Professor Jacques. It's always a pleasure to see you. It just fills my heart with joy to see both of you. For those who are maybe thinking of joining Fletcher, I just messaged Deji, for example, because I thought he may have been my former roommate. But he's an admin. You'll find that people at Fletcher, once they're in the mafia, they stay within the mafia. They don't leave, and this is great. This is just great for the community. It allows us to be in touch with our mentors. You know, for me, it's been a decade, and I hope decades longer. So coming back to your question, Professor Jacques, like many other Fletcher students and alumni and prospective students, my career has been value driven. The underlying motive has been to help others, to help to help the world, and so that's what's taken me from leaping from one thing to the next, from, as you said, campaigning for John Kerry, to working in women's rights, to working as a journalist, and then my career after Fletcher, which has included frontier market investing and negotiating infrastructure projects for the Rwandan government, and then now working on climate and energy in the Africa space. I think one thing that I remember is a conversation with my grandmother, who was, on the one hand, I made my family mad when I graduated from Berkeley and with a degree in economics, and I didn't go into a career in finance or go into a corporation. And my grandmother remembers me telling her that I wasn't in it to make rich people richer. I wanted to do something broader. But when I was working as a journalist in Pakistan years on, and I was criticizing the ex-banker Prime Minister Shaukat Aziz for some policies of his, she came back and shot at me and she said, well, how many jobs have I created? And so that was sort of one of the impetuses behind doing the MIB, because in business, that's where you can really be in the driving seat for creating jobs. And my post-Fletcher, my first job was in finance, and we were investing in growth equity in African companies. So it was very much related to that. But I also remember an Atlantic Monthly article which told the story of an ex-BCG consultant, Ira Magaziner, working for the Clinton Foundation, helping a generic pharmaceutical manufacturer in a least developed country realize that it could afford to sell life-saving drugs at a lower price so that they would save more lives, but without reducing their aggregate profits. Well, fast forward, months later, I met the founder of TLG Capital, who was investing in a Ugandan pharmaceutical manufacturer. And with Fletcher's help, with Dorothy's help, with your help, I convinced him to take me on, and we can talk about that a little bit later on. Fast forward again, I got recruited by the government of Rwanda, and I was sitting across the negotiating table from Ira Magaziner. We were negotiating an investment into Rwanda to set up a baby food manufacturer, and it was basically my job to well, it was my job to evaluate whether the proposition made sense for the government of Rwanda. So I ended up doing the analysis and making the case that it did make sense. And we had this Royal DSM company and the IFC invest in this factory in Rwanda. And that's what I think I'm continuing to do today. I'm trying to find ways of addressing some pressing issues, working in the energy and climate space.
So if you go back to your pre-Fletcher days and think back of your 2 years at Fletcher, how did Fletcher help you onto the next stage? What was really the value added of Fletcher? We know the cost, that's tuition. So the question on the plus side, what is the value added? We hope it's more than tuition and forsaken income for those 2 years, a positive net present value, if you will, of your decision to join the Fletcher School. What has been the big pluses of your time at Fletcher?
Well, sure, Professor Jacques, you taught me international finance, corporate finance. You taught me international financial risk management. Larry Weiss's accounting class, Dorothy's help in organizing an event and brokering meetings with impressive alumni. These all led to me getting my first job after Fletcher, my internship, and then converting it into an offer after Fletcher, which was with TLG Capital, who invest in frontier markets. I got recruited by the Rwandan Development Board while I was there, and I had several rounds of interviews which lasted over 8 months. But I ended up eventually interviewing with the CEO of the Rwanda Development Board. And one thing that really impressed him was not just that I knew finance, but that I also had a good knowledge of international investment cases. And that was thanks to Professor Salacuse's international investment law class. So I was able to rattle off the names of several Argentinian cases which were brought to ICSID suing a power utility. And then, of course, in doing the job, your class, the international risk management class, helped me prevent misguided investors and the government from applying, for example, Rwandan inflation rates to US dollar denominated payments. And that included, where my counterparties had gone to Harvard Business School. They didn't know about interest rate parity. And of course, your class and my experience before TLG Capital also helped me model investors' post-tax equity IRR and understand and figure out how I could structure agreements, public-private partnerships. So there was a lot of value add. Also, I did a colloquium. Dorothy was part of this colloquium when I was there, but it was led by Professor Rusty Tunnard, who I believe is retired now. So I worked on a project to promote political risk insurance. That was another, feather in my cap for doing my job better at the Rwanda Development Board. And so I think the Fletcher degree really helped me become a larger cog in a larger machine, and also helped me get paid much better than I was before.
I'm curious, why Africa? Before, when you graduated from Fletcher, I think you had limited experience with Africa. I don't think you had worked in Africa before
Not
Fletcher.
been to Africa before, no.
So what got you to Africa? Random? Was it interest, a passion that you had built and while at Fletcher?
Yeah, there were a few things, Professor. Probably Fletcher itself did not do much, but the fact that Fletcher guided me to, well, your influence and well, the students at Fletcher. I felt I had lived in 3 countries by the time I came to Fletcher, which was on the lower side um, of the average. And I felt, I felt a little bit of a complex because I thought this is an identity of mine that I've lived in 3 countries. So I decided that, I should go on this MBA exchange in France and expose myself to a new culture, a new language. And then being in France opened up Francophone Africa for me as well, because I started learning a bit more French. I hadn't really learned it at school. I learned German instead, which didn't really prove to be a very useful language other than passing the Fletcher graduate exam, language exam. But I had this thing. I did want to, from the age of 13, I was interested in working in Africa. I learned from my geography class that there was desertification in Burkina Faso, and that if the different agricultural techniques were adopted, they could combat that. My first choice actually after Berkeley wasn't to go back to Pakistan, but was to go to Tanzania, but it didn't work out for me. So I ended up going to Pakistan. But the desire was basically there because you have some of the poorest people in the world there, and that's where there's a lot of space to create value where others are not stepping up. It feels like you're very privileged, and you need to earn that right to and give back.
You mentioned your semester in the exchange program with HEC in Paris, and you touched on briefly on what you got out of it. Can you come back to it's very unconventional. Very few of our students, especially in MIB, decide to take a semester abroad, and it's in terms of transaction costs, this is not a minor effort on your part to put yourself from Somerville to France to Paris for 4 months or 5 months. So if you could reflect briefly on your experience, what you like, what you really disliked, what HEC offered in terms of curricular material and experiential material, job access. Well,
yeah, sure. So one thing that I'll say is TLG Capital told me that HEC would look great on my resume. They said that a semester exchange at an MBA looks better than ad hoc classes at Harvard. But as I said, I also had this feeling of an inferior complex, not inferior complex, but I'm behind my peers who have lived in more countries than me, and I need to catch up with them. I need to get a little bit more out of my comfort zone. And I remember my girlfriend leaving me at the airport or the train station. She spoke French. She was American, and she spoke Arabic as well. But she left me there, and I suddenly felt like, oh my gosh, I'm in a foreign country on my own, and I don't really know the language. And it's you learn a language that way. You make yourself conversant with what's going on and figure things out. It's a good challenge to have, especially when you're put yourself through, especially when you're in your young 20s, but I guess later in life as well. I can't speak to that. I haven't really done that more recently, but I got a lot out of it. In terms of the classes, I was able to take 10 classes in my semester, and I got a broad array of topics. So I took classes in private equity, intellectual property law, Islamic finance, mergers and acquisitions, tricks of the lawyer's trade, advanced Excel, and negotiation. So there was a few pros and cons. I didn't manage to take some courses that are classic Fletcher courses at Fletcher. I ended up taking them at HEC. But I also got exposure to some really good classes at HEC. And as I said, it opened up Francophone Africa for me. and now I'm very comfortable going to Paris and showing my family around Paris. So that's also a benefit, or traveling to France or traveling to other holiday destinations. And tomorrow I'm having a meeting that's taking place in French, and again, that's thanks to going to HSA. And actually, probably the person I hang out the most from graduate school here in London, because it's next door, is, you know, it's a friend from HSA.
Mm.
But I remember also meeting a student, one of your students in Kigali from HSA.
Did you actually study French while you were at HEC, or?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I had to. So I would, when I was doing my commute, I would listen to podcasts, and it wasn't in the curriculum. I have to teach myself. I honestly learned a lot more French when I was in Rwanda, because that was another. I could have gone one of two ways, and I made limited progress with Kinyarwanda, but there weren't really that many reading materials. Whereas I could read bilingual novels. So I ended up reading Victor Hugo, and that helped a lot.
Right. So when you think back of what you've done before Fletcher and after Fletcher, what would you say has been the one activity or career that you think has had the most impact, the most value created, to use the usual language? A lot of those things that you've been involved with, I would say, would have a major impact on the country or on the population. But you look back and say, this is the one that I think I made really a major contribution.
I think it probably has to be the way that I was listening to and understood investors' needs and converted them into something that worked out as an executed transaction. I listened to the government's needs, and I ended up, you know, making the case in economic terms because I valued externalities to make the case that this made sense for the government for what they were trying to get. I figured out what was the appropriate way to allocate risk and responsibility. So I think, you know, the thing that I did that had most value was structuring public-private partnerships for Rwanda, and a few examples of that, first of their kind in sub-Saharan Africa, were the use of blood to rural health clinics using drones with Zipline, and that was the first transaction of its kind anywhere in the world. And now Zipline is a $1 billion company, and I feel a little bit stupid for pursuing my PhD and not perhaps going there, knocking on their door for a job. But I felt like it was a conflict of interest. I structured the first water purchase agreement in sub-Saharan Africa with Matito, and also the first utility scale solar power purchase agreement with Gigawatt Global. The thing is, the private developers get all the glory. People forget that in a public-private partnership, there are people on the government side who have worked on figuring out how to make this feasible. So I think that's it, and that led to, you know, that experience meant that I contributed in a meaningful way to Rwanda's 2016 law on governing public-private partnerships, and I developed an investment tool for ministries, departments, and agencies to present their infrastructure projects that they wanted to structure as PPPs, and an appraisal tool for Treasury. So I think it would be that, but Professor Jacques, I think I've also had a big impact with some of my articles. I've kept dabbling with my articles. So in the FT, I wrote a piece on why pension funds, local pension funds, should be financing local infrastructure projects, and that got the attention of the president, and he relayed it to his cabinet, and they were made to action on it. In Pakistan's leading newspaper, Dawn, I wrote an article against a mega hydro dam, against a mega dam, and and I couched it in such a way that I was asking questions rather than making explicit statements. And I was saying, I was being very diplomatic. So I wasn't insulting or angering anybody. And you could see from the comments section that it had changed people's minds, and it seemed to change the rhetoric at the national level. In Pakistan, I also wrote an op-ed about why Pakistani should write an apology. Why should Pakistani should apologize to Bangladeshis for what happened in 1970 and 71. And I created an online petition so that people could apologize directly to the people of Bangladesh, because the government's not going to make that apology. And that got a lot of traction. That got a lot of press coverage in Bangladesh, also in India, and also I've been cited in a book on 1971. And then yeah, so that, I think those are big impactful things as well. I had one big impactful thing before Fletcher, but I had more afterwards. The one thing before Fletcher was an op-ed in the New York Times on the Pakistan's rape laws, and I think that helped push things along in terms of changing those laws.
Very nice, very nice. Now, you spent a number of years in Africa, and we'll come back to some of the projects you worked on. You came back to London, worked on your PhD, wrote a book. So what are you doing now? What is a new chapter in the post-Fletcher, post-Africa, post-PhD? What is the new chapter?
Sure. And I saw that Brennan Murray, MIB, also had a question. Should we let him ask a question after I answer this question?
Sure.
Okay, sure. So Brennan, I'll answer Professor Jacques' question and then let you ask yours. So what I'm doing now, well, primarily I'm working for the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. I'm building out I'm working as an energy and climate advisor, and I'm building out our climate practice within the Africa Advisory Team, which has over 200 embedded advisors across 17 African governments. And our vision is, my vision in the climate space is, our vision is to help governments access climate finance, deliver on their climate goals, adopt technology, and help them with their advocacy on issues such as what a just transition looks like, and how countries should be compensated for their custodianship of carbon sinks. But I'm doing a couple of other things as well. I'm also a postdoctoral research fellow at University College London, and I'm working on resilient infrastructure project research there. And I have until recently been teaching in the UCL's MSc in Infrastructure Investment and Finance. And then, you know, as an activist, I'm still involved in politics in the UK and European level, at the British and European levels. So I'm involved with the UK's 4th largest political party, but at the European and global level, we've got varying degrees of success. So I'm working on climate justice through those channels as well. Brennan, you had a question?
Yeah, thanks, Imad. And your portfolio of experiences makes me feel a lot better about my portfolio pre-Fletcher as well. But I'm curious about your transition out of Fletcher, and your first role was in the investment world, and that's sort of where I'm pivoting into, whether that's sort of early stage for a fund or institutional with a focus on climate or emerging markets. How did you engage with folks in the investment world, or which strategies did work or didn't work in conversations and trying to land that job with an investment firm? And then the second part of that is, you know, which classes or which skill sets at Fletcher should I make sure I don't leave without building? Would have been, especially in the climate context, I guess, energy. You know, what do you see as the skills that I need to make sure I have a good grip on before I graduate in December?
Great question, Brennan. So take Jacques 1, take Jacques 2, and take Larry Weiss, if you have time to as well. Take, I think, Professor Salacu's class on investment law is a very good class as well. Yeah. There's other materials that you can study in addition to the content taught there. The way, and with regards to climate, I don't know because I didn't actually take those classes at Fletcher, and I wish I had. But I think you should have an understanding of what scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions are. I think Paul Pullman has a very good idea about suggesting, he's the CEO of Unilever. He has a very good idea about scope 4, scope 5, and scope 6 emissions, which are emissions that you promote because of lobbying and just bad global citizenship, for bad laws, for emissions that you induce through advertising, so overconsumption, and also emissions that you help abate, taking them out of the air. So just be familiar with what scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 are. And I think it's worth keeping an eye on the news, basically. Things like Rishi Sunak saying that we need to have value at risk disclosed by all multinational corporations and financial institutions by 2025. Sorry, Rishi Sunak is the UK Treasury Chancellor. And that's probably going to percolate into other G7, G20 countries as well. But I can't tell you about, I think Amy Jaffe is probably teaching some very good classes, and Patrick Shane as well. I listened to a few of these Fletcher futures, and I think they had some very good and interesting things to say about impact investing as well. Patrick Shane can teach you about the fuzziness of that world as well. I think I really enjoyed, unfortunately, I don't remember the content, and I really would love to, and I really wish I had exercised using it, but Jenny Aker, and I wish I had taken Jenny Aker, both 1 and 2. So in addition to Nakostin, who was statistics 2.
Thanks, Iman.
You're welcome. Professor, sorry, did I answer your question satisfactorily?
Sure. I want to follow up on public-private partnership. You mentioned that this actually one of the projects you felt like you had a major impact. No, PPP are many different things, but I know you are very interested in value and valuation, and we all know the basic framework of valuation, projecting free cash flows or equity cash flows, and discounting them at the appropriate cost of capital, depending if whether it's free cash flows or equity cash flows. But how does that work for PPP? What does work and what doesn't work, and what is unique about the valuation process of public-private partnership? Especially that very often those partnerships need funding, so they're going to approach financial institution or even go to capital markets, and you cannot avoid valuation. At every stage, the valuation come back to haunt you, because that's going to be the kind of collateral behind the loan or the funding that you're going to be able to raise.
Yeah, great question, Professor. So in addition to looking at the free cash flows to equity and also the cash flows to debt, you need to look at the non-financial. You need to put in a shadow sort of cash flows for externalities that are not captured by the parties to the transaction. So for example, with Zipline, I considered the value of lives saved and I quantified that value, and it was a very rough value. I'm not hugely proud of the robustness of it, but basically what I did was, for example, I estimated Rwanda's GDP per capita on an annual basis is about $700. So if we save an X number of lives worth $700 in a year, that's that much more GDP contributed by these people. So let's add that to the cash flows, and let's see if this makes sense in terms of the costs that we have to over, the hurdle.
In those negotiations, you have private sector, whoever is investing. You have very often the World Bank or the IFC, or you have other multilateral, maybe the Asian Development Bank, and then you have government agencies involved. How do they respond to the private sector mantra of cash flow, net present value, and the more welfare economics concept of externalities and valuation of externalities, as well as the use of shadow prices when it comes to exchange rate, tariff duties, and so on and so forth, which also typically would be taken into account. You have multiple parties to the negotiation table, and I suppose some of them are very conversant with those concepts, and others never heard of it and say, "What is this? I want to build my dam, and I know it's going to be creating X unit of energy." And so, what was your experience when you sat in?
They're not usually in the room when I have those conversations with the government. I have those conversations as an internal advisor to the government. I'm making those shadow prices without them. In one instance, there was an investor who said, "Well, you're not taking into account the quality of blood that we're going to be delivering, and it's zipline. You're not taking into account that we're going to have less spoilage." So, again, I had to quantify that. They were saying that about the Rwandan government. So sometimes they do help you, but often then they're not giving you any any pointers. You have to, as an advisor, figure it out for yourself. Actually, and you mentioned energy. Do you mind if I segue into sharing what I did in my book?
Sure.
So in my book, can you see it? Sorry. No, you can't. Can you see it now?
Yes.
So in my book, I talked about how the World Bank in the 1950s and 1970s used only financial cost to evaluate different options, and that's how they decided that hydropower in Zambia would be the best solution. We live in a different world now. We live in a world of climate change. We have exceeded our planetary boundaries, and there's too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's not. And as a consequence, also we're seeing that hydropower is not reliable anymore in countries which are seeing an increase in droughts and are seeing an increase in frequency in droughts and intensity of droughts. So I created this matrix with different fuel options here on the left and different evaluation criteria here to consider when you're coming up with your model to figure out the relative costs and benefits. And so you do have financial cost as one of the things that you need to put into your cost benefit analysis model. But then you have a number of other considerations. First of all, I mean, this is a prerequisite. The source of energy needs to be either domestically or regionally available. SAP stands for Southern African Power Pool. So if it's not there, it's not an option. For baseload energy, this issue here I'm considering is baseload energy. For baseload energy, you need to look at whether it's going to give you a dependable supply of energy, regardless of whether, regardless of the weather. And hydropower is not going to do that when there are El Nino droughts. And solar and wind are intermittent, and for that reason, they're not going to give you baseload energy. And then this would ideally be life cycle emissions, not operating emissions. But for hydro, it's so complex. Every project is different. I just took it on an operating basis on an average, but this would be very different if you're looking at a particular project. Hydro can be up 8 times more harmful than coal in the near term and 3.5 times longer in the longer term. So the Kariba Dam hydropower plant is a lot more harmful in terms of global warming impact than coal. And the reason is, if you consider the emissions, the methane emissions that are coming from the reservoir, the global warming impact of those methane emissions is greater than the CO2 coming from coal, burning coal. So you need to take into consideration all aspects of the project and all knock-on effects. Also, when you have unreliable hydro, you have a lot of people using diesel generators, and diesel generators are also very harmful. So again, it's more harmful than gas from that perspective. And then you also want to consider harm to health and harm to the environment, and then other considerations that are particular to an energy source. So for hydropower, it's got, you have to consider the competition with water, for agriculture, and with nuclear, you need to think about the governance issues and what happens if you've got poor governance. You end up getting Chernobyl, or if you've got natural disasters, you get Fukushima.
So coming back to hydroelectric power, and I'm not an expert at this, but what I remember from hydroelectric power is a couple of things. It's the oldest renewable source of energy that we know. I mean, it goes back to the Middle Age or the 17th, 18th century. One. Two, it's, I think, in terms of contribution, it is more than nuclear power. It is more than all the other renewable and sources of energy that we have. So when I started to look at your book and your conclusion, I was really startled. And I think the key point that led you to the conclusion was, and I'm not sure whether this is recent or maybe it has been a problem all along, the fact that because of repeated drought, the supply of energy becomes very unstable and very unreliable. And you have somewhere, I think in your book, you evaluate the cost of disruption in the supply of energy for factories and so on and so forth. That's one factor. The other one that I was also very interesting to read about is the fact that there's more harmful emissions from the water, the body of water created by those huge dams than for coals. Now, does it mean that if you're going to have a dam with a relatively limited flooding, so you have depth, but you don't have width, you have less of a problem with emission? Whereas if you have a flooding that is very wide and encompasses square miles and square miles of territory, then the climate impact is much more dramatic. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you are, Professor. So yeah, there are a number of factors that go into determining how harmful a reservoir is going to be, and depth and surface area are two of those. Soil, underlying vegetation are other factors, and the temperature as well. But I think you've got the right idea, Professor. Yes, exactly.
So if you compare hydropower to, let's say, solar power or wind power, would your conclusion says hydropower is not as good as wind, not as good as solar, or because there are other factors? I mean, we know with, for example, wind power, there are major impact on, especially if it's offshore, major impact on marine life, birds migration and the like. Solar power, the equipment has to be refurbished, and it's quite polluting. So when you put all this together, hydropower is still not as good as the other, or it's different?
It depends, I think. It depends on the context. It depends on whether there is going to be a drought or not. And run of the river, if you've got a large enough river like the Congo River at Inga, run of the river can be hugely powerful and hugely reliable without storage, without creating the issues that come with the reservoir. It really depends. I have recently come across an article, and I need to investigate it further. I literally only came across it yesterday. That solar covering the Sahara may have unintended negative consequences as well, in terms of not allowing heat to be reflected and having knock-on effects on rainfall patterns around the world. I want to get into the analysis there, but that's quite worrying if that is the case. I'm not hugely excited by solar or wind because they are intermittent. I really wish that we could become more comfortable with nuclear power, where there are good systems of governance, where there are accountability mechanisms, and where there's a lack of natural disasters. I think nuclear is the safest way for us to reach net zero, and we need to get over our phobia.
You stayed too long in Paris. As you know, France is heavily dependent on nuclear power. The trouble is that most of the plants are way beyond retirement age, and France did make the upfront investment in the 60s and the 70s, but is having a hard time making the proper investment in the 2020s and 2030s to really bring the park of nuclear power plants up to grade.
Are those privately owned or are they state-owned?
Well, it's all mostly ADF. It's mostly quasi-government owned. But going
There's
back
a
to
public good issue there. Then I mean, they should be doing what's good for society. They should be making the investments. They shouldn't be under investing.
No. Coming back to hydropower, there's a special case of tide, and the relatively few factories or infrastructures that have been trying to capture the power of the tide. Would you have the same conclusion about tide power as compared to dam or your more traditional hydropower?
No. It's a different technology, and I haven't really looked at it. I haven't really understood how well it can be captured. I don't know enough about it. Yeah.
Imad, can I jump in with a question here? One of the things that I know is on a lot of students' minds is this just transition for the continent, right? And that's the big hairy problem that I think you're now currently, working on, and your book was obviously a prelude to it. And in particular, what's happening with African nations, right? On the one hand, they're going to bear the disproportionate, brunt of climate change, and yet at the same time, they do need access, to gas and cheap energy. And so, this whole process of industrialization that is occurring, for that. And so can you talk a little bit about some of the tensions there that you are working on at the Tony Blair Institute? And also, what are some of the potential capstone projects? Because all of our students, as you know, work on a capstone project. It could be a consulting assignment, could be for you potentially. So what are some of those capstone projects that students can wrap their heads around, that are out there on the frontier, that they can join and become problem solvers as well?
Sure, Dorothy. Great questions. With regards to what a just transition looks like, the issue is a lot of people in the world do not yet have access to even electricity. There's about 600 million of them. And yes, solar home systems get you partway in terms of getting some amount of electricity. It's not very high quality. If there's been a nation that's reached development without being a tax haven, I can't think of a nation that has become a developed country that's not a tax haven without industrialization. And if there is a country, then it's an exception to the rule, which proves the rule. A lot of countries in Africa have not industrialized yet. Cheap, reliable, climate resilient baseload energy is a prerequisite to realizing that industrialization. And a third of the gas reserves, is it a third or 2/3? I've forgotten, sorry, but a good proportion of gas reserves in the last decade have been discovered in Africa. So it's really, I think, appropriate for African countries to not be embargoed with border adjustment mechanisms, penalizing them for using gas to industrialize and take the paths that other countries have. Even if the gas supply in Africa tripled, I believe Africa's contribution to the flow of greenhouse gas emissions would increase by 1% from a base of 3% of global emissions. So it's not a lot. So just from a justice perspective, if we want to see our fellow human beings live even a fraction of the quality of life that we have, we have to make this allowance that they can use gas, and we need to figure it out and transition to nuclear or whatever. And I've just talked about industrialization, but gas is also a very important ingredient in the production of nitrogen-based fertilizers. And fertilizer is very underutilized in Africa, and there's a lot of malnutrition on the continent. And so there's another reason why African resources should be tapped and developed and exploited for use on the continent. With pertains to a capstone project, yes, I would be quite interested if someone wants to raise their hand in terms of helping me figure out an issue that I'm looking at. What I'm interested in figuring out is what compensation an international framework for compensating countries that are hosts to large swaths of carbon sinks could look like, and how that international framework would look like. I'm interested in looking at different methodologies for compensating countries with large carbon sinks. So maybe the opportunity cost of paying them the opportunity cost of not developing their resource, or arbitrarily deciding a value in contracts as we have in REDD+ agreements, or figuring out, maybe traded offsets make sense, and supply and demand for offsets, and regulation helps determine what the price is, or figuring out, what the extraterritorial benefits conferred upon companies and nation states are, and compensating them for that. So avoided damage to assets from flooding or other consequences of climate change. And what an international governance framework would look like, where net sequesters are paid for their sequestered carbon. So who would pay and who would not? And should this depend on the legacy of contribution of greenhouse gases and current net emissions? Who would be paid? Would it only be net negative countries, or all hosts of carbon sinks? Would it be low-income countries, or would it be all countries that, regardless of their income levels and their contribution to the stock of greenhouse gas emissions? And what would enforcement mechanisms look like in this international governance framework that compensates carbon sequesters? So I think I'd be very interested if somebody, if there's a student who wants to work on that, about talking about that.
Would some of those topics be the subject of a consulting project? Because related to what you were describing, you remember the course that Rusty Turner was teaching, that now Mr. Singh is teaching. There would be, I would think, that the Tony Blair Institute might be interesting in teaming up. I'm not sure, but there's a lot of convergence in, I think, students' interest and possibility of working for a semester on some of those emerging issues that you were describing.
Yeah, it's a burning issue. Literally. My understanding is that the semester that we'd have to wait till the next semester. So maybe logistically it might not work, but if we can get it off the ground and we haven't yet got to that point, then it could be a consulting project as well. And I have talked with Dean. How do you refer to her? Dean Kite. About, we have at the TBI, at TBI talked about this with Dean Kite as well. So definitely potential,
Well,
especially in the future.
Yeah, and we're committed to supporting you in this work, and it's absolutely in the Fletcher sweet spot. We are coming up against the hour here, and we could continue this fascinating conversation for quite some time. And I know there are more questions. So Imad, I know if you want to drop your email in the chat, if there are those that would like to reach out to you, that would be great for capstones or anything else. Thank you so much to you and Professor Jacques for this fascinating conversation. And we're looking forward to more books, more papers, more op-eds coming from you and highlighting them, and especially the work that you're doing with respect to climate justice and climate resilience on the continent. And of course, we will be curious to see where your career pivots go next. I know that you don't stand still, and nor we would expect you to. So we are super excited to see where you go next, and let us support you. And this concludes our session of this edition of Fletcher Futures, and looking forward to seeing everybody in person or on the Zoom tiles wherever we find you next. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. And Fletcher is so supportive and has always been throughout my career. So Deji, make sure you go to Fletcher.
Thank you, Imad. This was wonderful. Most interesting. I appreciate you being so candid about everything you've done and touched over the last 15 or plus years. So again, thank you.
10 years, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.